Good evening from the News Radio 1120 and 93.7 FM KPNW studios. I'm Krampus. This look at the news brought to you by Dr. Michael Bratland. He is the owner, proprietor, and brain behind Crisdental, where if you call him today, they'll see you today. I have a tooth cleaning. Well, actually, teeth cleaning. I have more than one tooth. Coming up this Monday, and I will say his staff does a great job. All right, here's a look at some of the stories we're following today. A large earthquake struck off the coast of California, southwest of Eureka this morning, and it prompted a tsunami warning for parts of the north coast of California all the way up to the Oregon coast to the Douglas-Lane County lines. Now, that warning was canceled shortly after noon, but the Oregon Parks Department actually kept all of Oregon's beaches closed until 3 p.m. Now, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, the 7.0 earthquake centered at the triple junction of the Pacific, North American, and Juan de Fuca tectonic plates. After the initial earthquake hit, two aftershocks of 5.8 and 4.2 followed a short time later after the initial quake. Talking to some friends in the Coos Bay area, apparently it was an area under panic. Schools were evacuated. Police were down on businesses near the beaches in Coos Bay, which is kind of on the southern Oregon coast, trying to evacuate them. The kids were sent, after they were evacuated from schools, they were sent to what they call tsunami safety zones, and then their parents were told to pick them up from there. And according to one of those friends, the traffic in Coos Bay was utterly insane. Fortunately, there were no injuries, and we don't really know the extent of the damage that happened in Humboldt County, which is essentially the area where that earthquake hit in California. All right, taking a look at some entertaining Oregon news. Monday, Governor Tina Kotek released her $39 billion set of budget priorities for the next legislative long session coming up in 2025. Democrats, by the way, in Oregon now have a supermajority in both the House and the Senate, giving them the power to raise and or create new taxes at will. Kotek says her primary focus is on homeless services, creating more housing, education, and behavioral health. And she told agencies, you've got to limit yourself to no more than a 1% increase over existing spending. But keep in mind, the budget is actually in the hands of a legislature, and they've already said they're going to go for major cost increases, in particular for the Oregon Department of Transportation. The number being thrown around there is an extra $2 billion. Now, that would be on top, apparently, of that $39 billion that the governor is suggesting. And now that they do have the power to raise and create new taxes, you can expect that's going to go a lot higher. Now, in response to the governor's budget proposal, House Minority Republican leader Christine Drazen said that budgets express priorities. And she says, it's clear Governor Kotek's priority is to protect the status quo. The budget has no new ideas and no new vision. What was put forth is more of the same for Governor Kotek. The governor's proposed budget is unsustainable without implementing substantial new taxes that, in her words, Oregonians cannot afford and do not support. She says, under this budget, Oregonians can expect to pay more but get less. And cynics to that would sarcastically say, well, yeah, that's what we voted for. Of course. Now, with Republicans preparing to take control at the federal level of the presidency and both chambers of Congress, Oregon Governor Tina Kotek proposed spending over $40 million in her budget on, quote, protective Oregonian values. Now, you may be asking, what's that? That will include that extra $40 million, at least $2 million for attorneys to defend progressive health, environmental, and civil rights policies in Oregon. It will also offer grants expanding access to abortions, $2.5 million as well in a reproductive health reserve fund in case federal funding declines for abortions under President Donald Trump. She also wants to set aside $7 million for legal help for illegal immigrants and $2 million in a bias response hotline. Oregon's progressive legislature for the past 2 years has also budgeted several million taxpayer dollars to provide for room and board for individuals coming to Oregon for abortions, as well as money to pay for those procedures. So as part of Oregon Governor Tina Kotek's existential freakout over Donald Trump becoming the president-elect again, this week Kotek sent a panicked message to President Joe Biden imploring him to designate the Owyhee Canyonlands in southeast Oregon as a national monument before Donald Trump takes office. Now, that move would ban all commercial development in the area, ranching, and access in general to the public, which has long been a goal of Governor Tina Kotek's supporters and radical environmentalists. Now, U.S. Representative for that part of the state, Cliff Bentz, and Oregon Democratic Senator Ron Wyden both have bills for the area to become wilderness areas as opposed to national monuments. But those two bills are different. Now, for her part, Kotek fears Congress won't have time to pass and reconcile the two bills before the end of the year, and she thinks that that leaves a national monument designation as the best option because Biden can just do that without any congressional approval with a stroke of a pen, assuming that he can find a pen or he remembers how to write. Now, Oregon Congressman Cliff Bentz called Kotek's letter to Biden a classic example of crying wolf. He says that a federal designation would actually draw more people to the region instead of improving it. Both Bentz and Wyden have proposed legislation that lawmakers, both of them, say would protect grazing rights and public use of the area, but those things stalled. Speaking of Eastern Oregon, leaders of a movement to move Oregon's eastern border are asking President-elect Trump to support the idea. The group, Citizens for a Greater Idaho, sent a letter to Trump on Wednesday telling the incoming president his support can, quote, bring a peaceful resolution to Oregon's long-standing east-west divide. Now, over the years, voters in 13 eastern Oregon counties have all passed measures pushing local leaders to join Idaho. That move would require approval of both states' legislatures and Congress. And the thing is, Idaho and their Senate and House, they've actually discussed it. And they didn't necessarily seem opposed to the idea, whereas Democrats in Oregon, from the governor on down to the House and the Senate, have all said, well, we don't think we have time for that. We can't fit that into our schedule to discuss it. In other words, saying to Eastern Oregon, screw off. Well, Oregon's K through 12 student enrollment saw a sharp drop during the pandemic, which we've talked about here on Get Real with Rick Dancer. And the state continues to face cascading declines as more parents see Oregon schools fail at even the most basic benchmarks, and they're pulling them out, sending them to charter schools, to private schools, or deciding to do homeschooling. One group of students, though, has seen steady growth over the past 4 years, and it's been pretty substantial growth. And that is multilingual learners. That's what the Oregon Department of Education calls them. Multilingual learners are students who grow up in households speaking a language other than English. And so they have to acquire English language proficiency in the Oregon school system. So in the 2023-24 academic year, 65,965 students held the status of multilingual learners. That's up by 3,500 from just the year before, making them 12.2% of Oregon's total student enrollment. And even though they're the fastest growing segment of students coming in to Oregon schools, they're also the state's lowest performing student group. That according to the state's achievement test. In the latest batch of Oregon statewide assessments, of those 65,965 students, 5.2% of them demonstrated any proficiency in English and language arts. 5.1% of them were proficient in math, and less than 5% were proficient in science. And together, those numbers are considered to be among the worst in the nation. Meaning that, once again, I can say, we're number last, we're number last. Chat along if you know it at home. We're number last. All right, well, this look at the news brought to you by Dr. Michael Bratland at Crisdental. And now it's time for Mr. Dancer to get real.